With January of 2025 now just a little bit into the rearview mirror, I thought now would be a nice time to look back on the first month of 2025 and see all of the tech news stories that you pretty much only found at the Lunduke Journal, or that were broken by the Lunduke Journal. It was quite a bit. January wasn't even a weird month for that sort of thing. It's crazy how many tech news outlets just ignore and bury so many stories because it doesn't fit their political narrative. It's insane. So we're going to go through all of that today in case you missed anything. And first, I want to say thank you to all of the Lunduke Journal subscribers for keeping the lights on here. The Lunduke Journal has a rather unique business model. This is what I do full time. The Lunduke Journal is a full-time thing which allows all of the reporting that you see here, but I get to do it without taking any money from big tech or from any advertisers at all, which means that there's no big tech influence. There's no ads in any show. In fact, if you watch the Lunduke Journal shows, you know that you start a show and it immediately gets into the content. It immediately gets into the news and the opinions and the analysis. In fact, we don't mention anything about where you can even go to subscribe to things until the last 10 seconds of any given show. It's amazing. But in order to do that, we are supported entirely from subscriptions from people like you. Go to lunduke.com. There's a number of different ways to subscribe. And in fact, only once a month, maybe for a day, maybe for 2 days, I remind people, hey, try to subscribe. Here's a few discounts that you can get to subscribe to the Lunduke Journal, just to have a nice little incentive, as a nice little perk, a nice little thank you. And right now we're doing that through the end of Tuesday, February 4th. You can grab lifetime subscriptions, or you can grab discounted MP4 DRM-free downloads. All sorts of stuff from the Lunduke Journal. If you go to lunduke.com and scroll down, there's a little fund indie tech journalism huzzah link right there. And you can click that link to get the lifetime subscriptions, or discounts, or other such goodness. All right, now let's dive right on into it here. First, we started out the new year. January 1st, the first story of the year. Employees speak out. Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Intel discriminate against white men. This is a real story. Really a collection of stories of people who worked at, Apple and Microsoft and everywhere else, literally speaking out and finally feeling like they can speak out without getting fired about all of the amazing racist and sexist hiring practices that are happening at so many of these companies. I'd like to hire you, but unfortunately, you're a white male. It's a direct quote. Another guy said, I was told I can't be promoted for being a white man explicitly at Google. I mean, over and over again, people talking about how they can't get a job in certain departments or certain companies because of their skin color or their sex. That's crazy. And it's crazy that this story ran so under the radar of most tech news outlets. I mean, the Lunduke Journal's been covering it for quite some time now. The lawsuits happening with Red Hat and IBM and issues with Netflix and Apple and so many other companies doing these extraordinarily racist and highly illegal hiring and firing practices. And yet, most tech news sites are just ignoring it completely. I should also point out, as we go through this month's shows, I'm doing this all from X, right? From the site formerly known as Twitter. And I'm doing that because you can get the shows from the Lunduke Journal a bunch of different places. Normally, I show people the shows and the thumbnails from the shows over on Locals because I spend so much time there, and Locals is just such a great way to get the show without any ads or algorithms or anything like that. But if you're on X or you're on YouTube or you're in a podcast feed type of guy, you can get it just about anywhere. So I'm going through on X and showing you the shows on X. A lot of people, I think, don't think of X as a video publishing platform, but it really is. In fact, some of the shows that I've published to X have gotten significantly more views on X than on YouTube during the month. Not all, but a good number of them. And I mean, YouTube isn't one of our largest platforms here. I think the audio podcast is the biggest, but still, X is showing a tremendous amount of growth, and it's impressive. All right, on January 3rd, we talked about H-1B visas and whether or not H-1B visas were a good thing or a bad thing for the tech industry in general. And I brought in a whole lot of my personal anecdotes of being a manager, hiring and firing people, sometimes with and without H-1B visas over the last few years. And then things really kicked off. I guess it's a little bit out of order. January 2nd, things really kicked off when I published a show entitled, Are There Any Non-Woke Operating Systems? And I made the point that so many operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux, are decidedly woke. And I don't just mean the people that make them have political opinions that it would be defined as kind of woke opinions, because I don't care about that. I don't care what someone's personal political opinions are. I really don't. But what I wanted to point out was that so many of those groups are taking specific actions based on that wokeness, right? A lot of Linux distributions, for example, outright ban people if they have centrist or right-leaning politics, and ban people for their skin color, ban people for their ethnicity or their gender. And I'm like, this is crazy. This is taking this wokeness and making it decidedly discriminatory and bigoted, and I don't like it. I don't like using an operating system knowing that the people who build it hate me and are trying to hurt me. Like, that doesn't feel good. And so, all things being equal, if there's a good operating system option for me, I would like to use one that isn't like that doesn't hate me. And in fact, I don't need it to know anything about me. I don't need it to have an opinion about me. I just want it to not hate me. And so I put that call out there. Are there any non-woke operating systems? Because gosh darn it, this is getting ridiculous. It's getting friggin' ridiculous. And boy, did I get a response. Oh my gosh, this is one of my favorite news stories of the month. It wasn't the one that got the most views or anything, but it's one of my personal favorites. The president of the Open Mandriva Association. Open Mandriva is a descendant of Mandrake Linux, one of the granddaddies of, super user-friendly Linux. And he got a hold of me and was like, man, we are super not woke. Quote, we are, of course, a Linux-based project, so we certainly use some code from the woke crowd. But in our own project, we're pretty much the opposite. And he had so many different examples about how they're just not woke. They're a meritocracy-based system and an organization. They don't choose anything based on skin color or woke or DEI politics. They just write good code, right? And anyone, left, right, up, down, forward, back, no matter what your politics, can be involved, can use it. And they're not going to make any statement for or against you. They're just going to make good code. And they think the woke stuff was dumb. And it was one of the best emails that I'd received in quite some time. In fact, it was great because they didn't state any of this anywhere. You go through their website, they don't even talk about it because they're too busy, as they put it, writing code and getting stuff done. They don't have time to make political statements. They're working on the code. They're working on making a good quality operating system. And this just absolutely blew me away. This totally blew me away. And on the flip side of that, on January 6th, same day, I reported that OpenSUSE Linux, right, an extremely woke desktop Linux operating system and server Linux operating system, had gone so woke that they'd mass banned everyone who even smelled a little conservative, myself included, because I used to be an elected board member of this particular Linux distribution. I worked on it for years. They banned me because I was too conservative. They banned anyone who seemed like they might be conservative. They just mass banned people. And so their membership ranks just dwindled. So much so that repeatedly, they kept having to repeatedly cancel their elections because they couldn't find anyone to run for their elections. They couldn't find anyone who was willing to run for their board of directors because they banned everyone who did all the work. This was it was just it was funny to me to see the difference between those two. Then on January 7th, it came out that the U.S. government, this was again before President Trump took office, so this was under President Biden, specifically put out a Department of Defense order that made it so that many organizations in the United States, including the Linux Foundation, could no longer do business with Tencent and Huawei, which are big organizations contributing to the Linux kernel. This is a big deal, and this was massive. I reached out to the Linux Foundation, didn't get any response, and that followed up obviously from last year's news, late last year, where the Linux Foundation mass banned Russian programmers for similar reasons, because there were sanctions against Russian programmers, and so they came in and they banned Russian programmers from working on the Linux kernel. And they hadn't made any statement about any of that stuff. And now more government sanctions were coming into play, including Tencent and Huawei, which are big users and contributors of Linux. Really, really big news, because of course, they work with Chinese military companies. And then after a couple of days, the Open Mandriva story kept going, because I wanted to use Open Mandriva, right? If there was a great Linux distribution that didn't hate me, of course I wanted to use it. So I did a review of Open Mandriva's rolling distribution known as Rome, and it's fantastic. I really, really liked it. In fact, that's my new current operating system on all of my personal machines are now running Open Mandriva Rome. I'm really, really enjoying it. It's great. I mean, it's not, there's multiple Linux distributions out there that I would say from a technical perspective are of excellent quality. There are multiple, and I think you can make a very good case why someone would like or prefer using one or another based on the command line tools or the default graphical environment or many sort of different options. But Open Mandriva, from a technical perspective, is exceptionally good. And for me, really importantly, they don't hate me. They're a non-woke system, how it should be, not political, merit-based, a meritocracy, focusing on code. So I did that review on January 8th, and it was a ton of fun. And then on January 9th, this is not news. This is just fun, because I firmly believe that computers should bring us joy, right? So much of the reporting that the Lunduke Journal does ends up being about, very intense politically charged topics related specifically to software and operating systems and computers and open source and everything else and big tech. But the reason that I get into so many of those topics is because those topics are specifically harming computing. They're harming the history of computing. They're harming the computer industry. They're hurting the people who are programming computers. They're hurting the users of computers. They're doing significant harm. And so it needs to be covered so that we can reduce that harm, right? We can help solve the real problems that are plaguing the computer industry, software, gaming, hardware, all of it, and make things better, bring things more joy. Well, that also means sometimes we don't necessarily need to just cover hard news, but we need to just talk about things and work on projects that just bring joy, just simply add joy of nerdiness to the world. And so I brought back a retro DOS-based BBS on January 9th, the House of Lunduke BBS, which you can download into at bbs.lunduke.com. I put up a video talking about it where you could go play old school, late 1980s, early 1990s DOS dial-up BBS style games right now, and it's still running. It gets I don't know how many users every day, but it's active. There's games of Trade Wars and Legend of the Red Dragon, which means nothing if you weren't a BBS kid back in the 80s or 90s, but those were big games back then. And it was just a fun thing to do because we got to add joy to things, right? We got to focus on the nerdiness and the joy. There's no politics there. It's just pure nerdy joy. There needs to be more of that in the world. On January 10th, the Linux Foundation launched a pay-to-play inclusive supporters of Chromium-based browsers initiative, sort of a sub-foundation of the Linux Foundation. This was a truly bizarre move from the Linux Foundation that was spurred on very heavily by Google. I got comments from Brendan Eich, the CEO of Brave, the Brave web browser, and the creator of JavaScript, and from Andreas Kling, the developer of the Ladybird web browser project, and I kind of went over that in my own personal views, but it was a very strange move that they were doing this, and I felt like they were setting something up, which we'll talk about more in a moment. On January 10th, we also talked about Meta ending their DEI programs, ending fact-checking, and allowing, for the first time in forever, criticism of LGBTQ blah, 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 and allowing vaccine skepticism on their platform. This is a big move, and it's a massive change to one of the world's largest technology companies. I mean, Meta, beyond just running Facebook, and I know me and many other people just don't even like Facebook, but they contribute to a number of open source projects. They do a lot involved with gaming and servers and all sorts of stuff. And so their impact across the tech world is actually pretty significant beyond just running Facebook or Instagram. And so when they make this massive of a shift in terms of both what they allow on their platforms and what they do internally, that's noteworthy because it impacts not just their employees, but the downstream projects they work with, as well as some of the other companies they work with. So a pretty significant shift. On January 11th, the next day, I had a very fun story that was just more ridiculous than anything else. Massive memory leaks in System 76's Cosmic Desktop written in memory-safe Rust. Now, this is just a goofy story, really. A really short little story. In fact, one of the more popular stories of mine of the week, just because it's so utterly ridiculous, of the month, because it's so ridiculous. So System 76 is a computer vendor. They make computers that ship with Linux as a desktop environment. Their desktop environment is a custom one that they've built, and they have a desktop environment that they're building themselves that they call Cosmic, and it's still in alpha. It's about to become beta. They've talked about it becoming beta quality pretty soon. And one of their big selling points of this Cosmic Desktop environment is that it's written in Rust, right? They talk about this repeatedly. The main developers behind this have bashed on people who program in other languages because you should be programming in Rust because it's memory safe. And the number of memory leak bugs in this Cosmic Desktop they were developing were just huge, to the point where you have to reboot your systems regularly and all sorts of stuff. And so I had to make fun of them a little bit. I'm like, oh, your memory safe desktop environment sure does have a lot of memory leaks in it. And it was just a jokey thing. And a lot of people who love the Rust programming language because it's memory safe started yelling at me on the internet about it. Lunduke doesn't understand what memory safety is. In fact, there was podcasts and YouTubers who did reaction videos to this. They were like, let me explain to you what memory safety is, because Lunduke, he doesn't understand. He's never used a computer before. And they were just going off on it. And I think they missed the point that it was kind of a joke. I was having fun at their expense. And move on from that one. And then we talk on January 14th about the Linux Foundation possibly purchasing Chrome. Now, this is not a news story. This is not an announcement. This is just an analysis. You remember when we talked a couple days earlier about the Linux Foundation creating a Chromium-specific kind of subgroup inside the Linux Foundation. And I started thinking about why they would do that and what the other organizations involved, what their placement in all of this is. And then I started thinking about it in terms of the lawsuits that are going on currently, the antitrust lawsuits relating to Google and Chrome. Because the Department of Justice has won a lawsuit against Google. And what they're asking the judge to do in that lawsuit is to force Google to sell off Chrome. Now, we're a couple months out from seeing if that's going to be the case. We're going to find that out this year, assuming Google doesn't file and win some sort of appeal. But assuming that moves forward, we're going to find that out this year. And so I started thinking, what if I was Google and I wanted to retain a certain amount of control over Chrome and the Chromium web browser engine, and I was being forced to sell Chrome to someone else? What would I do in order to retain as much control as possible? And one of the possible options is working with an organization that is easy to control through monetary means like the Linux Foundation, and get them to own Chrome, maybe through a consortium of Microsoft and multiple other companies all coming together in sort of a one organization that they all pool their funds and pool their resources to buy Chrome. That way they can all use it. But that becomes a distinct possibility. And so I talk about that a little bit and kind of go into my analysis of it. We'll see if I'm right. But I think that's potentially a backup plan for Google, is to have this foundation that the Linux Foundation created have some control of Chrome once Google is forced to sell it. We'll see how it goes. Now, along the lines of keeping computers really fun, I had an interview with the guy that works on, one of the main guys that works on the FujiNet hardware. And the FujiNet hardware is this little adapter. This little adapter that is, it's not just an old modem emulator, but you plug it into like an 8-bit computer, like an Apple II, right? Or an old 8-bit Atari or a Tandy color computer, right? Those old late 70s, early 80s 8-bit computers. And it grants you Wi-Fi internet access with a whole host of functionality, including SSH and file transfers and all sorts of stuff right on the device. So thus it brings like an Apple II onto the modern internet. Very cool. Very, very, very cool. So I got to talk to him for over an hour back on January 15th. Highly recommend listening to that. It's not political. It's just purely fun. On January 16th, Apple begged their shareholders to let them continue their illegal DEI policies. Yeah, they've got a shareholder vote coming up, I believe, in February. On February 25th, they're going to have a shareholder meeting, and there's going to be a vote about ending the company's illegal DEI policies, right? So all the shareholders get to vote. The board of directors of Apple is begging, they're begging shareholders to not force Apple to stop doing DEI stuff, because Apple's board of directors really, really, really likes doing illegal, racist, sexist hiring practices. That's literal. I mean, I challenge anyone to disagree with me on that. That's very literal. And this is called Proposal Number 6, Request to Cease DEI Efforts. We'll know more about that at the end of February. But Apple's just begging their shareholders, please don't make us stop doing DEI stuff. On January 17th, tech journalists rally in support of racism and sexism in big tech. Basically, I just go over all of the tech journalists, or just a collection, a small sample, really. There's just a bunch of them, of tech journalists that are furious. I mean, just angry that there might be an end to DEI policies, racist, sexist, illegal DEI policies that are getting companies sued, like Red Hat, IBM, and whatnot. There's an end to some of them in some companies, like Meta and others, and they're furious about it, and they're blaming Trump and Elon Musk and Nazis, and it's off the charts. It's crazy, but I just had to show that how much they were rallying in support of racism and sexism in big tech. They're really for it. Almost every tech news outlet, with the exception of the Lunduke Journal. The Lunduke Journal is the only one who hasn't come out in favor of racism and sexism, which is crazy. Yeah. This one's good. I got several proposed community notes on my X post on this one. Godot game engines from January 20th. Godot game engine went woke and lost $160,000 per year. Now, what I showed was several months back. Was it last August, October, something like that? The Godot game engine, the Godot open source game engine, they went hard woke. They enacted a cleansing, as it was called, of anyone who seemed like they were conservative, anyone who didn't openly come out and support, very woke DEI sort of stuff, right? People were getting banned from contributing to the Godot source code repository because on a social media network, they said something like, you know what, maybe an open source game engine should just focus on the code for an open source game engine and not worry about political stuff. Ban, cleansed. And after that happened, things went crazy, right? They got a bunch of people stopped contributing to Godot. A bunch of people started contributing to Godot because they're like, yeah, stick it to those conservatives. I'm going to give you money. And then other people were like, ooh, this is gross. And then they stopped giving them money. So it was this wild roller coaster for a little bit. But after things settled, I took a look at it. And in January, the Godot game engine had lost over 25% of their yearly revenue. And so, go woke, go broke, go dough. It happened. They lost $160,000 per year. It was crazy. But yeah, I got community noted on that one. That was another big story for the month. And then on January 21st, man, there's a lot of news. On January 21st, Open Mandriva, I took a look at it, right? Because the Open Mandriva story was, just a couple weeks old, where they came out and said, I'm Open Mandriva Linux and we're a meritocracy and we're not, political and woke and all that, right? So I wanted to see what happened, right? Because let's analyze the results of things, right? If a software project or a company comes out and says, okay, we're super woke now, what happens after that, right? Like, we just looked at Godot and we saw that Godot, as the months went on, lost a lot of money after they went hard, kind of super woke, where they started banning people. And we saw the thing with OpenSUSE Linux, where they went so woke and so ban happy of conservatives that no one would even run for their board of directors for months on end. They had to continually delay their elections multiple times. So what happens though when a Linux distribution or an open source project comes out and says we're not woke? What happens next? And the analysis was awesome. I mean, it was great. It was more than what you would hope it would be. The search trends on things like Google went up like infinity percent. It went up so high right after that news story broke that it made every day before it go down to 0 and 1% relatively, meaning that the highest day of searches for Open Mandriva in Google history was after it came out as non-woke by like 1,000%. It was crazy numbers, right? Was it 15, 20 something percent of their total forum users signed up in the couple of days after this happened, and the forum had existed for a decade before that. It was crazy. And what I kind of wanted to point out to people was this was not like a Lunduke Journal effect, because the Lunduke Journal references a lot of projects, right? And, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. You don't see this happening for anything other than this project came out as non-woke. The Open Mandriva came out as non-woke in a hard way, through the roof, right? And it becomes a really interesting case study. Now, we don't know yet what those numbers look like long term. Do they stick around? Do 3 6 months on, do those increases stabilize somewhere? It'd be interesting to see where that goes. But at least the first few weeks analysis is astounding. I don't know why every Linux open source and whatnot project doesn't come out and say, yeah, I'm non-woke too, because the amount of success you instantly see because of that is off the charts. It's worth noting. On the January 23rd, Brian Lunduke, took the mandatory DEI training of the Linux Foundation and became DEI certified. This is a very real thing. I walk you through what getting that certification is like. They are still doing that certification, and the reason I walk you through that is because now that Donald Trump took office in the United States, executive orders have been signed which make it so that if you are doing work with military or government contractors, you cannot have DEI policies, right? It's the law right now. The Linux Foundation does significant work with government agencies, including the Department of Defense, and they are still requiring mandatory DEI training, including mandatory DEI training of government officials, which is fascinating. There's yet to be a comment from the Linux Foundation on this, but I wanted to call it out. And of course, this mandatory DEI training included stuff like you had to listen to things about how Black Lives Matter is great. And pronouns are so awesome. We got to use a lot of different pronouns, critical race theory, micro inequities, and DEI stuff. It was nuts. So I walked everyone through that. On January 24th, it was found out that FOSDEM, the largest free and open source software convention in Europe, canceled a keynote presentation by Jack Dorsey, the guy who founded Twitter, right? This happened, and this was the crazy thing. Because of a threat of a protest by this is not an exaggeration, this is just what it is, a child pornography enthusiast and extreme leftist named Drew DeVault. And this guy came out, that's what he is. He's really proud about it. And this guy came out and said, no, Jack Dorsey can't speak at FOSDEM because he has a lot of money and we shouldn't allow that. And so this child porn enthusiast threatened to protest, and apparently FOSDEM backed down, or Jack Dorsey withdrew, or something happened, and they canceled that keynote because of it. It was really, really bizarre, just truly, truly bizarre. And then on January 27th, a story started breaking. That was not true. A story started breaking that Facebook was censoring people who talked about Linux, including people just saying Linux or talking about or putting links to Linux distributions and all sorts of stuff. And every open source and Linux centric tech news outlet started running with this story. Can you believe Facebook? They're censoring Linux. Well, it turns out that was absolutely not what was happening at all. That Facebook was censoring links to one specific website called DistroWatch. And it was just because DistroWatch had some, was linking to a piece of malware on it. There was one archive or something that was being linked to. And so Facebook was flagging that site. But everyone was like, oh my gosh, Facebook says you can't talk about Linux. Facebook says Linux is malware. None of that was true, but it didn't matter because it was such a fun story. And then on January 27th, I pointed out that Microsoft, Blizzard, Activision, because Microsoft purchased Activision, which purchased Blizzard Entertainment, the game company, right? And so it's all Microsoft now. An artist working on the games for Blizzard Activision called for the murder of Trump voters. Now, I don't really care too much about what one crazy guy says on, his Facebook page. That's not news. But what is interesting is how mega big tech companies respond to their employees making threats against people based on political ideologies. And so I reached out to Microsoft, Blizzard, and Activision, their CEOs, their press departments, everyone. Like, what do you guys think about this? Like, are you guys okay with someone who, right next to your name, right next to the name Microsoft, Blizzard, etc., says, go kill your local MAGA person, right? Are you okay with that? Never got a response back from Microsoft on that. However, that particular person scrubbed his social presence, deleted everything, locked down his X and LinkedIn and his Facebook page, everything. He scrubbed it all. So he's all offline now. But as far as I know, he still works at Microsoft. To me, that's newsworthy. Not that there was a crazy guy who said something awful. That happens. But that the company, as far as I can tell, didn't necessarily take any action and didn't make any statement distancing themselves from it. Because it doesn't take time to do that, to say, hey, don't kill people. Right? Like, we, Microsoft, are anti-killing people. It's simple, right? You don't have to say a whole lot more than that. And they didn't. Weird. That's bizarre to me. Then I had a story on January 29th as all of the hoopla about DeepSeek's AI was going on. I kind of went through and pointed out some of the issues here. DeepSeek is copying existing AI data, censoring the results, and collecting your data for China, right? They're an organization controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, reportable to the Chinese Communist Party. Whatever the Chinese Communist Party says, they have to do. And the amount of data they were collecting and are collecting is fairly extensive. In fact, they make a point of saying that they are partnering with advertising agencies to do pattern matching to determine like what other data they can figure out about you based on what your searches are. So they know, let's say, what websites you've gone to outside of their AI system, and they can kind of combine that all together. And they say flat out that they're providing it and selling it to other companies. And to me, that's just like, oh, giant red flag. So I wanted to make sure people knew that that was not great. And then I started noticing, as the days had gone on from that Facebook story where, oh my gosh, Facebook is censoring Linux and saying Linux is malware, that even though this had been proved to be not real, every tech site was running with it. Every subreddit was talking about it. People on social media were like, oh, can you believe Facebook? They think Linux is malware. They're censoring. And what we were watching, and I realized this, was the creation of a new myth. And if you've been hanging out around the Lunduke Journal for a long time, you know that I spent a bit of time debunking computer myths. Things like the first computer bug was an actual bug. It was a moth. That's a myth. It's a fun story. Some of you may have heard that story. It's not the real story, right? It's not real. Bill Gates once said 640K ought to be enough for anybody. Really fun story. I have quoted that quote many times. It's not real. It's not real. It's a myth, right? And so I tend to like to debunk myths because facts and accuracy are really, really important to me because computers are important to me. I like computer history. And so what we were watching here with this Facebook says Linux is malware thing was the creation of a myth. Right in front of our eyes, a new computer myth was being born. And so I kind of walked everyone through how that seemed to be happening and the mechanics of the creation of a new myth. And I guarantee you, years from now, people are going to be quoting that saying, remember the time Facebook said Linux was malware and censored Linux? Totally not true. But they will think it's true because they'll be able to quote hundreds of articles and podcasts and YouTube videos and social media posts that all say it was true. So clearly it's true. Right. And by the time you're a few years down the line, any evidence to the contrary will exist solely in the Lunduke Journal. Right. That's what's going to happen. I just thought it was interesting, worth pointing out. And then as the month of January came to a close, Debian Linux doubled down on their wokeness. they they decided they were going to leave X, leave the site formerly known as Twitter, and do so in a big hubbub, right? And try and gain like some DEI wokish brownie points, virtue signal points for doing so. They gave a bunch of reasons for it, including how evil Elon Musk is, how they need to have diversity. There's fake news, something about gender. It didn't make a whole lot of sense, but I covered it because Debian wanted to go down that road. So we'll cover it because it needs to be covered. But I think it made a lot of people kind of sad that Debian was going so hard down the woke road. And it wasn't a concern that, oh, they decide not to have a social media platform. That doesn't matter. They can have an X account or not. I could care less. It's how they did it. You know, it's making the statement about diversity and Elon Musk and genders and whatnot. When that comes right hot on the heels of them pushing internship programs at Debian, where anyone is allowed to sign up for the internship programs as long as they're not a white guy. That's a real thing. And I covered that here in previous months in the Lunduke Journal as well. And no one else did. And it's just over and over again. It's almost like they're ramping up their embrace of hardcore wokeness. Why? I don't know. At a time when you're seeing so many Linux distributions suffering and faltering and crashing because of their embrace of wokeness, and then you see a case study like Open Mandriva who says, I'm not woke, we're just going to focus on the code and merit, and anyone can hang out with us, it's fine. And they go through the roof to the moon, etc., etc., etc. They're doing great. Why doesn't Debian go that route? I don't, it's bizarre to me. It's bizarre to me. And then we end the month with January 31st and the Linux Foundation finally, after 3 months of total silence, they finally made a statement about the banning of Russian programmers. And this was legitimately interesting, though, because they didn't just make a statement about why they banned the Russian programmers several months back. In fact, they didn't even really get into the specific banning of Russian programmers, though it was alluded to enough that we knew what they were talking about. What they created was really an article encouraging people who run open source projects to be very careful and wary about sanctions between countries, because the Linux Foundation was running afoul of that. You remember when we saw Huawei and Tencent? Huawei and Tencent got added to a list by the DoD, which meant that the Linux Foundation probably couldn't work with companies or people working with Huawei and Tencent anymore, because the Linux Foundation is an American-based entity, right? And so they started giving people suggestions of how to avoid potential issues. Because I think the reality is, while I have many criticisms of the Linux Foundation, they're smart, right? The people who run the foundation are no dummies, right? They've been thinking about this, they've been studying the legalities of this, and they recognize, just as the Lunduke Journal has, that because of the wide variety of sanctions against Russia, against multiple Chinese entities and others around the world, and including sanctions between Europe and Russia and multiple countries, it's not just a USA thing, that there was a real problem brewing within both big tech companies, working with contractors, working with outside firms, and open source projects. Because if an open source project, let's say, is based in the USA or based in Europe, and some of their contributors, including users submitting bug reports, are in countries or working for or with companies that are on sanctions lists, then that open source project is now in violation of those sanctions. And there could be very, very significant legal penalties relating to that. And so the Linux Foundation went through that, and I walked through a lot of that in the show on January 31st. And it's worth looking at that one if you are involved in any open source project, even if you work with a big tech company and you think, you know what, I think some people I work with have some tangential relationship even with Chinese corporations, Russian programmers, on and on and on. Worth thinking through all this, because there's very significant legal ramifications. And that brings us to the end of the month. And oh my gosh, it was just one news story after another. Almost every day, it was a new news story. Sometimes several in the same day that other tech news outlets just ignored completely. And we're talking stuff that could shake open source to its core. We're talking about projects rising and falling. We're talking about lawsuits kicking off, government sanctions, and just on and on and on. And so many of these stories are getting ignored. So thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers for making this all possible. Once again, go to lunduke.com, find out how you want to watch, listen, interact with, read anything from the Lunduke Journal. Lots of options, iTunes and Substack and X and YouTube and locals and it's everything's there. Heck, you can watch most of these shows on Facebook if you want to. I don't even like Facebook that much, but I like you guys, and so I just provide options for you. And I want to thank everyone who financially supports the Lunduke Journal, because this really is the last bastion of truly independent tech journalism. That's not just a catchy, witty tagline. There's no, when you look through the stories that we covered in January alone, I'd say 70% of them, we were the only game in town, right? They either broke at the Lunduke Journal and started here, or we were the only ones covering it. And some of these spread far and wide through the podcast and everything else, thanks to all of you. And I could not do this. I could not do this work if it weren't for your support. If I had to go out there and seek advertising dollars, corporate sponsorships, and the like, well, then big tech could tell me what to talk about, right? If I took Microsoft money, I couldn't cover anything Microsoft related or tangentially Microsoft related. If Microsoft did business with a company that did something shady, I couldn't cover them either. And that's what you see with all the other tech news outlets. Even when they're critical of a company, they have to keep themselves reserved. They can't look too deep. They can't really see where the skeletons are buried. I get to do that. And it's pretty amazing. And it's thanks because we do it entirely subscription based here at the Lunduke Journal. People pitch in a few bucks a month. Sometimes they get annual subscriptions. Some people get lifetime subscriptions. You can get subscriptions on Locals or Substack or Patreon. You can buy on itch.io. If you go to lunduke.com, there's an itch link there. And this is really cool. This is really cool. This is not the biggest way most people get this show, but it's just such a cool thing to offer. You can get a yearly subscription, right? You pay once, and you can get every show released by the Lunduke Journal as a DRM-free MP4 that you can download. Then you can watch it, you can back it up, you can convert it and look at it on, I don't know, your old Palm OS device, or find a way to convert it to being usable on a Game Boy. I don't know. You have an MP4, you can watch it wherever you want. You can back it up. It's great. There's no DRM. You don't have to be online. You can enjoy it offline. You can burn it to a DVD. I don't care. Right? It's just a cool thing to offer. So go to lunduke.com, find some options. And of course, if you do that before the end of the day, Tuesday, February 4th, there's some discounts there. Again, it's right in the middle of the page on lunduke.com. You can get some discounts. You can get a lifetime subscription if you grab it before the end of the day, Tuesday, February 4th. And then that's the only time we'll offer that for the rest of the month of February. We'll probably offer that again in March, but if you want it now, grab it now before the end of the day Tuesday. But even when this little discount is gone, just the regular monthly subscriptions really do help keep us online, and it keeps us big tech free. And no other outlet can say that. And one of the great benefits here, I know I'm rambling, but one of the great benefits here, and I can't stress this enough because this is awesome, is when you go listen to a show, you turn on a show from the Lunduke Journal, what happens? Are you greeted with, "This episode brought to you by cornflakes and hot dogs"? Like, no, that never happens. Never happens. We get right into the show. We immediately start talking about the show. It's not until the very, very last couple seconds of the show that I even say, "Hey, by the way, go to lunduke.com." I mean, this look back at the last month notwithstanding, that's the only time we really even do that. It's amazing that I get to do that, right? You go to most YouTubers, filled with product placement, podcasts. This one brought to you by the square spacing things. Like, okay, great. And they all can't tell you the truth because they'll piss off their sponsors. So not only by going elsewhere, are you inundated with ads, but you're not going to get the truth. Lunduke Journal, no ads, all truth. Love it. So thank you. Thank you to everyone. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, thank you for making it possible to do all this coverage during the month of January. The month of February is already off to a rockin' start, and I'm really excited about what the next month has to hold. With that, I do declare end broadcast. Oh, I have to actually click a button over here. That's the button. I found it. See you later, everyone.